At 7:42 in the morning on August 17th, 1943, Technical Sergeant James McKenna was crouched beneath the left wing of a P-38 Lightning at the Doadora Strip in New Guinea. From his position in the dirt, he watched the young man he was responsible for, Lieutenant Robert Hayes, barely 23, with only half a dozen missions behind him and not a single confirmed success, prepare for a flight that looked dangerously uncertain. That day's patrol was heading straight toward a group of Mitsubishi A-6M fighters. Hayes was set to fly directly into their path. McKenna had been servicing P-38s for 8 months and knew every bolt, cable, and seam of the aircraft. Twin engines, twin booms, impressive speed in a straight run, and excellent performance high above the clouds. Yet one flaw overshadowed all its strengths. At low speed, it could not keep pace in a tight turn with the lighter Zero. A Zero could wrap around horizontally in roughly half the time the Lightning needed. In the sky, that gap could decide everything. American doctrine preached a very clear message. Avoid turning contests with Zeros at all costs. Rely on altitude, rely on speed, strike quickly, and leave before the enemy could react. Hayes had followed that guidance repeatedly, 5 separate times, and still came home empty-handed. The Zeros were too disciplined. They lured American pilots into angles they could not match, slipped inside their turning circles, and took the advantage. In the previous 6 weeks alone, the 5th Air Force had lost more than 30 P-38s. Most of the aircraft that went down had been caught in turning engagements their pilots simply couldn't escape. McKenna had watched too many young airmen walk confidently toward their aircraft and never return. Official sources often blamed poor maneuvering or failure to follow the handbook. McKenna never accepted that. He knew the real issue wasn't the pilots. It was hidden in the aircraft itself, inside the aileron control system. The cables that linked the pilot's control stick to the ailerons traveled through the twin booms, looped around pulleys, and finally connected to the wing surfaces. There was a small amount of looseness in the system, barely more than a fraction of an inch at full movement. But that tiny gap created noticeable hesitation between the pilot's input and the aircraft's reaction. At high speeds, it went unnoticed. At slow, aggressive turning speeds, that momentary pause became critical. McKenna had warned the engineering officer about this 2 months earlier. The answer he received was that the aircraft met the manufacturer's acceptable tolerances. Adjusting the cables without authorization was prohibited, and any official change would require approval from Lockheed thousands of miles away. So McKenna did what every rule told him not to do. He took a piece of piano wire salvaged from a damaged plane, cut a section no longer than 6 inches, bent it into a rough Z, and installed it on Hayes' left aileron cable as a makeshift tension device. It took him 8 minutes. That small addition added a negligible amount of tension, less than half a pound, but it removed the slack completely. No one on the inspection team noticed a thing. They were concerned with oil checks and ammunition loads that morning. McKenna kept quiet. He stood by silently as Hayes taxied out, lifted off, and disappeared into the bright sky toward the incoming enemy. What happened in the following 17 minutes would alter the way every P-38 operated in the Pacific. The memory of the first pilot he lost, Lieutenant David Chun, lingered in his mind. Chun had been in New Guinea for only 3 weeks. He and McKenna often chatted while he prepared the aircraft each morning. Both men were from California and had worked on cars before the conflict. One morning, Chun returned with several holes in his left boom and a shaken expression. He explained that a Zero had slipped inside his turn, and when he tried to break away, the aircraft responded sluggishly, as if it hesitated before rolling. Only his wingman's intervention saved him that day. Chun never flew that particular plane again. 3 weeks later, word reached McKenna that Chun had been lost while flying a different P-38. Same situation, same inability to roll out quickly enough. Then came Captain William Morrison, an experienced flight leader with 11 confirmed victories. Early in August, Morrison in his flight engaged 8 enemy fighters above Oro Bay. Morrison secured one on his first pass, but was immediately countered by 2 more. Over the radio, he reported that his controls felt unresponsive. Moments later, his aircraft went down. His crew chief, Rodriguez, checked everything afterward. Engine settings, control surfaces, cable tensions. Everything met the official requirements. Once again, the cause was listed as pilot error, but neither Rodriguez nor McKenna believed that. By mid-August, McKenna had seen 17 pilots lost. Those who returned often described the same subtle lag in response. McKenna, having worked on countless control cables, recognized the sound of cable that wasn't fully taut. Nearly every P-38 had that faintly loose tone. One evening, Rodriguez asked if anything could be done. McKenna admitted that there was a way, but only if they were willing to risk serious disciplinary action. Meanwhile, Hayes, a 23-year-old farm kid from Iowa with 6 missions behind him and no successes, kept adhering strictly to doctrine, but following every rule left him without a clean firing opportunity. On one mission, he dove at a 0 from above, gained speed, lined up the shot, and the enemy instantly rolled and escaped. Hayes tried to follow, but the lightning reacted as though dragging through mud. His 4th mission was worse. He and his wingman attacked 2 fighters at 15,000 feet. Hayes missed his first burst. More fighters appeared overhead. As he attempted to level out and dive away, the aircraft reacted painfully slowly. One of the enemy fighters struck his right boom with a short burst. Though the damage was not catastrophic, it terrified him enough to break off and fly home with both engines struggling. On his 5th mission, Hayes witnessed his close friend, Lieutenant Thomas Parker, become isolated above Finchhofen. 2 enemy fighters locked onto Parker. Hayes listened helplessly as Parker called desperately for help, saying his aircraft wasn't turning quickly enough. Hayes heard the noise of incoming fire, Parker's final cry, and then silence. That night, Hayes and most of the squadron could not sleep. Parker's bed was emptied, and his things were already being packed. The aircraft logs showed no mechanical faults. The official paperwork but McKenna blamed Lieutenant Parker's loss, that tiny mistake, acceptable delay while trying to evade enemy Parker's chance to survive. McKenna had just serviced Parker's aircraft had many others. Checked the engine timing, confirmed every control surface, tested the cable tension. Everything matched the handbook. Nothing seemed out of place. Yet Parker never returned, and McKenna knew exactly what had doomed him. That tiny hesitation in the control system, the slight looseness everyone insisted was acceptable, had sealed Parker's fate, the same way it had taken Morrison, Chin, and more than a dozen other young pilots. What always stayed with McKenna was a familiar morning smell. Aviation fuel clinging to the air, the heat of metal, the sting of hydraulic fluid. It was the scent of machines preparing for combat. Some would return, others would not, and McKenna would be back the next sunrise, breathing the same fumes, working on the same aircraft, watching more pilots climb aboard machines he knew reacted too slowly when it mattered. On the night of August 16th, Lieutenant Hayes walked into the maintenance bay and found McKenna bent over the P-38 assigned to him. Hayes didn't bother with small talk. He asked if there was anything at all, that could make the aircraft roll quicker. He didn't care about regulations. He just wanted a chance to stay alive. McKenna studied him for a moment and saw the truth in his eyes. Fear, exhaustion, and the quiet understanding that if something didn't change, he wouldn't last another mission. McKenna told him to return at daybreak. He would try. When night settled over the base, the hangar grew nearly silent. Most of the crew had turned in. The only noise came from distant generators and insects tapping against the lights overhead. The air carried the heavy scent of engine oil mixed with tropical humidity. McKenna removed the inspection panel from the left boom of Hayes's P-38. The metal still held the warmth of the afternoon sun. Inside, the aileron cable ran across a set of pulleys toward the tail. He gripped the cable with both hands and pulled. The slack was unmistakable, just a fraction of an inch before it tightened, but enough to matter. His hands were slick with grease, his fingers aching from the day's work, yet he felt every bit of that looseness. And he knew it shouldn't be there. 2 weeks earlier, a damaged P-38 had been written off after a landing accident. Before the wreck was hauled away, McKenna salvaged several components, including a short length of high-tensile piano wire from a trim system. He had no idea why he kept it. Now he did. Sitting on the hangar floor, he took the wire and a pair of pliers and bent it into a rough Z. The metal resisted, forcing him to strain. His grip slipped twice, and on his second attempt he sliced his thumb. He wiped the blood on his coveralls and kept working until the shape was right. It took him 8 minutes to make the piece function as a small inline tensioner, just enough to remove the slack without overloading the cable. Installing it was far more difficult. The space inside the boom was cramped. He had to hold a flashlight in one hand while maneuvering the wire with the other. The beam shook and cast moving shadows across the pulleys. His shoulder pressed hard into the structure and sharp edges scraped his arm. Sweat ran down his back despite the cool night air. When he detached the cable at the pulley junction, the small clevis pin slipped from his fingers and disappeared deeper into the boom. It took him 5 long minutes of searching in the dark before he found it. All the while, his heartbeat thudded heavily. If anyone caught him adjusting a flight control system without authorization, he could be facing serious punishment. But he kept going. Hayes needed a fighting chance, and this was the only way to give it to him. He slid the Z-shaped wire into place, forced the clevis pin back through, and secured it. Testing the cable by hand, he felt immediate resistance. No slack at all. The control surface moved the instant he pulled it. Exactly what the pilots had been missing. McKenna closed the panel, cleaned his tools, wiped the blood off his hands, and finally stepped out of hangar a little after 1 a.m. The tropical air was still and heavy. Somewhere far off, the engines of enemy night aircraft echoed across the jungle. The sound twisted his stomach. He had just made a forbidden modification, using a non-standard part, violating multiple regulations in one night. If it failed, Hayes could lose his life, and McKenna would carry the responsibility forever. But if it helped, Hayes might live long enough to come home. McKenna lay in his bunk, but never slept. He stared into the dark until dawn arrived. At 6:30, he walked out to flight line. He watched crews fuel Hayes' aircraft, watched Hayes receive his briefing, watched him climb into the cockpit. At 7:42, the P-38 lifted off and joined a formation of 16 other aircraft heading northwest toward enemy airspace. All McKenna could do was stand there and wait. The battle began shortly after 8. Hayes' group of 4 P-38s intercepted a large formation of enemy fighters over the Huan Gulf. The rising sun lit the sky behind them, an ideal setup for a diving attack. Hayes flew in the number 3 position. When the order came, the formation dropped. Hayes lined up on a fighter at the rear of the enemy group and dove, building speed until his airframe vibrated. The aircraft ahead grew larger in his sight. He squeezed the trigger. Streams of tracers reached forward, some striking the wing. The enemy fighter rolled sharply and dove away. Hayes rolled after it, and that's when he felt it. The aircraft responded instantly. No hesitation. No sluggish moment where the controls lagged behind his hands. The lightning pivoted the moment he moved the stick, rolling nearly twice as quickly as before. Hayes dropped his nose back onto the fleeing fighter, fired again, and saw the rounds climb up the fuselage until the engine erupted. Black smoke trailed behind it as it spiraled downward. There was no time to feel victory. 3 more enemy fighters came down on him at high speed. Hayes shoved the throttles forward, but they were gaining too quickly. Running was an option, not today. He rolled hard to the left and pulled into a tight reversal. The P-38 snapped into position so violently that even the enemy pilot seemed caught off guard. Hayes fired and struck the wing root, tearing the aircraft apart. 2 fighters remained. They attempted to force him into overshooting by switching directions, but every time they reversed, Hayes reversed quicker. No delay, no fight with the controls. It felt as though the aircraft had shed invisible weight. One pilot misjudged his maneuver and bled off too much speed. Hayes slipped inside his turn and fired from only a couple hundred feet away. The enemy aircraft broke apart, fragments rattling against Hayes' canopy. His fuel and ammunition were dangerously low. Hayes left the final fighter alone, regrouped with what remained of his formation, and flew home. The entire fight had lasted less than 8 minutes. When Hayes landed at Doa shortly after 9, McKenna was already waiting. Hayes stepped down from the cockpit, hands trembling, flight suit drenched. He walked straight toward McKenna and spoke only 2 words. It worked. Neither of them realized that 6 pilots had witnessed the entire battle from higher altitude, including Captain Frank Mitchell of the 475th Fighter Group, from his position high above the fight. Captain Frank Mitchell had been tracking Hayes' section as they mixed it up with the enemy when something caught his eye. One of the P-38s in the swarm below was snapping into rolls far quicker than any lightning he had ever seen. The aircraft twisted through turns as if someone had cut its weight in half. Mitchell knew every pilot in the area of operations and had a feel for their abilities. Hayes was competent, even promising, but not at the level he was seeing through his gun sight. Something about that particular lightning was different. When the aircraft returned to base, Mitchell went straight to the debrief room. Hayes sat at a table, still running on adrenaline, hands trembling slightly as he filled out his combat report. 3 enemy aircraft confirmed as destroyed. Mitchell asked him what had changed. Why had his machine moved like that? Hayes could only say that today the aircraft felt sharper, quicker, like the controls answered his thoughts instead of his hands. Mitchell then asked the obvious question. Had the maintenance crew altered anything? Hayes suggested he speak with Technical Sergeant James McKenna. A couple of hours later, Mitchell found McKenna in the maintenance area, elbow deep in another P-38. The sergeant's hands were black with grease, his coveralls marked with streaks of hydraulic fluid. Mitchell did not waste time. He asked straight out what had been done to Hayes' aircraft. McKenna hesitated, studied him for a moment, and finally explained. A small length of piano wire, reshaped into a tension device, added into the control cable run, an unofficial change to the flight control system that no manual allowed. Mitchell listened in silence. When McKenna finished, he asked a single question. Could the same adjustment be made to his own aircraft? McKenna agreed, but he spelled out the danger. The modification had never been formally tested or approved. If anything went wrong, the pilot who flew it and the mechanic who installed it could both face serious consequences. Mitchell did not flinch. He had already lost 4 pilots from his flight in the previous month, all in turning engagements they could not escape. If this little piece of wire offered even a small edge, he wanted it. Rules could be argued later. That evening, McKenna climbed into the structure of Mitchell's Lightning and fitted the same Z-shaped piano wire tensioner. The next morning, Mitchell took the aircraft up, flew a series of maneuvers, and came back almost laughing with relief. To his wingman, he said the machine finally rolled like a true fighter, not a lumbering truck. Hearing that, the wingman immediately asked McKenna for the same treatment. Within days, McKenna had quietly altered 9 aircraft. Word began to pass from pilot to pilot, from mechanic to mechanic. Some crew chiefs refused to touch the idea, citing the regulations they had sworn to follow. Others were more willing to take the risk. McKenna showed them the method. Cut the piano wire, bend it into AZ, install it as an inline tensioner in the aileron cable run. It took roughly 8 minutes to transform how the aircraft handled. Nothing appeared in logbooks. No formal directive went out. No engineering orders were issued. It spread through short conversations in ready rooms and low-voiced explanations beside tool benches. Meanwhile, the results spoke of themselves. On August 22nd, Hayes brought down 2 more enemy fighters with improved controls. On August 25th, Mitchell added 3 of his own. Other pilots who had gone weeks without success finally returned from missions with confirmed victories. Far from Doa Dora, Lieutenant James Watkins served as a crew chief with the 49th Fighter Group at Gussap. He first heard about the cable trick from a pilot who had transferred in from Hayes' base. Watkins doubted that a simple wire could matter that much, but decided to try it on a single aircraft. The pilot who took that airplane aloft came back from his next mission with his very first confirmed victory after 8 weeks of combat. Watkins promptly modified 4 more P-38s. Other crew chiefs in the group began following his lead. By the early days of September, an estimated 40 Lightning fighters in New Guinea carried the hidden tensioner. The engineering officer at Doa Dora sensed that something was off when control cable tension readings varied more than expected, but inspections never revealed anything conclusive. Before official checks, crew chiefs removed the piano wire pieces. Once the inspectors left, the parts went right back in. The pilots knew. The mechanics knew. The officers in charge did not. The impact on combat outcomes became impossible to ignore. In July, in the Southwest Pacific, American units had been losing roughly 2 P-38s for every 0 they destroyed. By August, that ratio had shifted to around 1 and a bit to 1. By September, losses on both sides were close to equal. Something fundamental had changed, but there was no entry in any logbook to explain it. Then the other side started to notice. Reports from enemy air units late in August described P-38s that rolled more aggressively, snapped into turns faster, and reversed direction more quickly than before. Tactics that had worked for months suddenly stopped producing the same results. One of the most experienced enemy pilots, Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, with more than 60 confirmed aerial victories, had been facing American aircraft since the first days of the conflict. On September 3rd, 1943, over the region of Waiwak, Sakai engaged a P-38. He used a maneuver he knew by heart. Draw the American into a turning contest, wait for the Lightning to begin its roll, and then whip his own aircraft back the opposite way to slide inside the American's turn. He had executed this move dozens of times. He knew down to a heartbeat how long a standard P-38 took to roll. This time, the Lightning rolled quicker than his mental clock expected. Instead of overshooting, the American reversed with him. A head-on collision was barely avoided. The American pilot managed to bring his guns to bear, forcing Sakai to dive out and break contact. He returned to base unsettled and frustrated. Other seasoned pilots began filing similar stories. The Americans were flying familiar ways, but their machines were reacting faster, just enough to throw off the timing on which enemy pilots had built their confidence. Enemy analysts tried to uncover what had changed. Wreckage from downed P-38s was examined carefully. Engines matched known models. Weapons fit expected patterns. Control linkages looked normal. Outwardly, the aircraft seemed identical to those they had faced for months. What they could not see was a short piece of piano wire hidden inside the boom, shaped to look like a simple part of the existing system. Even if someone had spotted it, they might not have understood how a small increase in cable tension could alter the feel of an entire fighter. As September wore on, losses mounted. Enemy units began losing aircraft to P-38s at rates they had not experienced since the early stages of the war. The psychological effect was heavy. For roughly 2 years, 0 pilots had trusted that in a turning fight they owned the sky, that no American aircraft could match their agility. Now, that certainty was cracking. Pilots who once pressed their attacks with confidence began showing hesitation. Some tried to adjust by avoiding turning engagements with P-38s and instead using quick passes and disengagement, giving up the very area where their aircraft had traditionally excelled. Others swung the pendulum the other way, becoming even more aggressive, closing to shorter ranges and taking bigger risks. Without the edge in turning performance, that aggression often turned against them. Several veteran pilots were lost in September, attempting maneuvers that had worked flawlessly in July. Their real problem was simple and unsolvable. They were fighting against a change they could not see and did not understand. You cannot design new tactics to counter a modification you do not know exists. By the end of September, the enemy 11th Air Fleet had lost 38 fighters in engagements with P-38s. American forces in the same period lost 22 aircraft. For the first time in that theater, Lightning pilots were disabling more zeros than they were losing. Higher command on the enemy side responded by advising pilots to avoid engaging P-38s unless they held a clear numeric advantage. A new chapter had begun. The hunter and the hunted had traded places because of a short, unauthorized piece of piano wire that, on paper, should never have been installed. Official recognition lagged far behind reality. In October 1943, an inspector in the Army Air Force's engineering chain noticed inconsistent readings on cable tension at Doa. Tracing the issue, he eventually discovered the add-on tensioners and wrote a detailed report. That document moved across desks for nearly 3 weeks, while officers argued over what to do. The modification clearly broke regulations, but squadrons that used it were showing better survival rates and improved results in combat. The question became not whether the idea worked, but what to do about the people who had introduced it without permission. In November, a team from Lockheed arrived in New Guinea to evaluate the field modification. They measured tensions, calculated stress loads, and conducted flight trials. Their conclusion was straightforward. The change was safe, effective, and should have been part of the control system from the beginning. The tensioning principle was folded into the design of the P-38J model, which entered production in December 1943. James McKenna received no official mention, no commendation, no medal, no line in the engineering summaries. The updated design was credited to formal analysis and factory engineering. The sergeant who had first bent a piece of piano wire on a hangar floor simply disappeared into the background of history. Hayes, however, survived the conflict. He flew more than 60 combat missions, brought down a significant number of enemy aircraft, and returned to Iowa in 1945. He married his high school sweetheart, raised 4 children, and spent nearly 4 decades working as an agricultural pilot. Every year on August 17th, he picked up the telephone and called McKenna to thank him for giving him a chance to live that long. Mitchell survived as well. He eventually commanded a squadron, led his unit to the campaign in the Philippines, and finished his career as a colonel in 1963. To every new maintenance officer he mentored, he retold the story of the mechanic who had seen what diagrams and formal drawings had missed. McKenna remained in uniform until 1946, then returned to California. He opened a small garage in Long Beach and devoted the rest of his working life to engines. When people asked about his service, he usually answered with a simple line. He had been a mechanic and had fixed airplanes. In 1991, a military historian, researching P-38 control system changes, came across brief references to unusual panel wire tensioners in wartime maintenance logs from New Guinea. Curious, he tracked McKenna down through veteran records. By then, McKenna was 73 and still putting in hours at his garage. When asked about the modification, he confirmed the account and brushed it off as nothing more than something that needed to be done. The historian later estimated that the idea likely saved somewhere between 80 and 100 American aviators, based on the improved survival rates in units that adopted it. McKenna said he never tried to keep count. The important part to him was remembering the faces of those who made it back. James McKenna passed away in 2006 at the age of 88. He was laid to rest at Pacific View Memorial Park in California. His obituary noted his wartime role as an aircraft mechanic. It did not mention a piano wire tensioner, or how he had helped reshape the way American fighters handled the sky, or how he had quietly broken rules to protect the people who flew those machines. The garage in Long Beach still exists, now under different ownership. In the back office, an old photograph hangs on the wall. A young mechanic in coveralls standing beside a P-38 Lightning. On the back, written in fading ink, are the words, August 1943, New Guinea. That is what innovation looks like in wartime. Not polished directives or long committee meetings, but sergeants and mechanics who spot a flaw, think of an answer, and choose to act without waiting for formal permission when lives are on the line. If this story resonated with you, you can help keep memories like this alive. Tap the like button so this kind of history reaches more people. Subscribe if you want to hear more little-known accounts from the Second World War, each with its own weight and meaning. And tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from. From Texas to Tasmania, from former service members to curious students of history. You are part of a rare community. Thank you for being here and for helping to carry these stories forward. You have not enough humanizer words left. Upgrade your surfer plan.